Between 1820 and 1840, manufacturing in New York increased by 262%. It brought New York luxury goods and tourists, and some people viewed the Erie Canal as revolutionary. The next step of evolution in American transportation was the Transcontinental Railroad. Most of the impact came from the flow of goods, and it replaced the wagon trains of previous decades. Commerce increased between the states, allowing over $50 million worth of cargo to be shipped every year from 1869 to 1879. Goods from Asia and raw materials from the West were shipped to the East even faster than before. The Transcontinental Railroad is really what allowed the West to catch up with the Eastern way of life, as more people could now move west and products of the manufacturing boom were shipped to the West. Before this, when you think of Western movies where things are very hard-scrabble and underdeveloped and cut off from civilization, this is true in the West throughout the entirety of the 19th century, but especially before the Transcontinental Railroad. So while the nation was still divided due to the Civil War, the Transcontinental Railroad helped unify the nation and help it develop economically, leading to its power in the 20th century. The Transcontinental Railroad impacted the U.S. economy by transporting products and people, leading to economic growth. And the United States manufactured 30% of the world's goods by 1900. All right, so that's the Erie Canal, and that's the railroad system. Let's get back to the highway system. Even before Ike's journey, there was an understanding that America's roads needed to be improved. Since the late 19th century, the Good Roads movement had been advocating for upgrades to the dirt and gravel tracks that connected cities to one another, and also forming associations to finance and build them, because the state government and federal government had very little involvement with the maintenance of roads. Author Tom Lewis traced the Good Roads movement to Albert A. Pope, a Union Civil War veteran. In 1878, he created what he called a safety bicycle. Pope organized the League of American Wheelmen, which advocated better roads through efforts including financing road engineering courses at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. According to Lewis, by 1900, 300 companies produced more than 1 million bicycles per year, and the Good Roads movement was sweeping across the country. So there you go. Before nice bike paths were the hallmark of every fashionable city and urban planning movement, it was big in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The bicycle was one of the best means of portable transportation over shorter journeys, and much cheaper than owning a horse, to be sure. In 1913, as automobile ownership starts to really increase, the Lincoln Highway, one of the earliest transcontinental highways for automobiles, or more like a route, like I explained earlier, was dedicated. This 3,400-mile highway crossed 13 states from New York to San Francisco. But it had roads that varied widely in their quality, and you could encounter things like quicksand along the way. Woodrow Wilson signed the first Federal Aid Road Act into law on July 16, 1916. This act created the Bureau of Public Roads and allocated $75 million for the next 5 years. Now the federal government is really stepping up its involvement in road maintenance and road creation. Federal funds would pay states half the cost for building or improving federal roads. At this point, there were more than 21 million horses, 3.5 million cars, and 250,000 trucks in the United States. But during World War I, troops drove new army trucks and materials from factories to the Midwest to eastern ports where they could be shipped to Europe. With the war mobilization effort, mechanization really takes a spike in America, and this raises awareness of the need for better roads in the United States. Not roads that accommodate horses and maybe automobiles as a nice thing, but really putting the automobile first. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. And there were convoys before the one that Eisenhower was on that also took a long time. One in December 1917 went from Toledo, Ohio to Baltimore, and that took 3 weeks. But beyond the desire for better military mobilization and making things better for motorists was the push for better roads to accommodate trucks. Trucks were gradually becoming competitive with trains as a way to move freight, and they went places that rail lines didn't go to. But trucks weighed more than automobiles, and their tires were solid rubber, So the nation needed better roads than those that were handling the small Model Ts. Paved roads crumbled under the wear of these trucks. By 1919, the Bureau of Public Roads had spent only about half of the $75 million allotted, and only 12.5 miles of road had been constructed. Well, the push for the federal highway program was not universally popular. Thomas McDonald, who became chief of the Bureau of Public Roads in 1919, appreciated the need for a connected system of interstate highways, but he didn't believe that a separate national system under a federal commission was the way to achieve it. He also questioned the assumption that long-distance highways were necessary for national defense. He said that what was needed was a system of roads connecting military installations. McDonald instead believed that state highway departments should be strengthened and that road building should be mostly farmed out to states. The 1921 Federal Highway Act also held this view, that strengthening state highway departments controlled the highway system and maintenance was the way to meet this need. Well, funding of highways increased after World War I, and by the end of the 1920s, the BPR had spent $750 million on roads. So this early act, the 1921 Federal Highway Act, made the idea of a national road system real. Each state would designate 7% of its roads to be linked with those in other states. The numbering system for U.S. highways begins in the 1920s, and the Lincoln Highway from Pennsylvania through Wyoming became U.S. Highway 30. The Bureau of Public Roads commissioned General John Pershing in 1922 to draw a map that could be used for the construction of roads and for the purpose of clarifying which roads would be most important for defense if the nation was at war. This was called the Pershing Map, and it became the first topographical map of the United States. Pershing was a leader of the American Expeditionary Force in World War I at the Western Front. He was a mentor to a number of other U.S. generals, including Eisenhower. While other presidents picked up on this and also supported a transcontinental highway system for the purposes of defense. In the 30s, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt proposed routes for a transcontinental system of roads to the chief of the BPR, and it could have happened, but World War II and then later, after his presidency, the Korean War interfered. Roosevelt was president from 1933 to 1945, and he had been involved in road building during his tenure as governor of New York, and he took personal interest in early studies of the Interstate System. By this period, in the second term of the FDR administration in the 30s, more Americans owned cars, and highways were getting more congested. They couldn't handle these small dirt or gravel roads. There was increased public support for the construction of transcontinental superhighways. Roosevelt launched several public works projects that pulled the nation out of the Great Depression, and he saw a network of toll superhighways as a way to provide jobs for the unemployed. He thought a system of 3 east-west and 3 north-south routes would be good enough, and at that time maybe it could have been. Congress also got involved at this time as well. The Federal Highway Act of 1938 directed the Bureau of Public Roads to study the feasibility of a 6-route toll highway network. A report was commissioned in 1939 called Toll Roads and Free Roads, and the Bureau concluded that with some exceptions, the amount of transcontinental traffic was insufficient to support a network of toll superhighways. Instead, the report recommended a 43,000-mile non-toll highway network in its master plan for free highway development. The proposal called for highways to follow existing roads whenever possible, have more than 2 lanes of traffic available if traffic required it, and be limited access in high traffic areas. The proposal allowed for above or below grade intersections in large cities and limited access belt lines surrounding the central business district to permit traffic to bypass the intercity and to link intercity expressways. And this is mostly how interstate networks are today. Roosevelt supported the plan and sent it to Congress in 1939, saying that instead of imposing user tolls, the cost of highways could be recovered by selling off federal land along the right-of-way to home builders in other cities. Critics in and out of Congress condemned the suggestion, calling it a socialist scheme to transfer the cost of providing deluxe highways from those most benefited to the already heavily burdened landowner. It was more popular to think of things in terms of tollways, and those that use it would pay for it back then than today, although tollways are still popular, especially in the East Coast. Overall, reaction was favorable within the highway community. With the outbreak of World War II, the need for a national system of highway dropped in priority. But toll roads were being built by the states. The Pennsylvania Turnpike, now I-76 and I-70, opened in October of 1940, and this was the prototype of the high-speed interstate highway. The Hutchinson River Parkway and the Merritt Parkway, both toll roads, opened in New York and Connecticut, and they were highly profitable. Other freeways and toll roads were incorporated into the interstate system at the time of its creation in 1956. Attention refocused on the Federal Highway Program as the war turned to the Allies' favor. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944, which was enacted after 9 months of intense negotiations in Congress, was the largest highway bill in history. It authorized a limited 40,000-mile national system of interstate highways to be selected by the state highway departments to connect the major metropolitan areas and to serve national defense. But the plan was passed without any provision for construction funds because Congress rejected the president's suggestion from raising money by selling off excess right-of-ways. When President Roosevelt died in 1945, Harry Truman became president just before the war ended. He had been a judge in Jackson County in Missouri, and judge didn't have a legal meaning but was more of an administrative position, and he understood why roads were important. He once headed a road organization called the National Old Trails Road Association that promoted a road across the country on famous roads of the past. He built a network of concrete roads in Jackson County and was a member of the American Road Builders Association. When he became a senator in 1935, he used the drive to and from Washington on a 2-lane road, which is part of the National Old Trails Road he had once promoted. But after Truman became president and after the war ended, a big focus was on the government concentrating on promoting housing programs. This was the beginning of the baby boom, and children were being born in enormous numbers. Construction companies that could have built roads were instead needed to build new houses. And then in 1950, just as things were calming down and President Truman could have focused on an interstate system, the United States joined the United Nations in a military action in Korea. So again, the United States entered a wartime period. The Public Roads Administration, the successor to the Bureau of Public Roads, was responsible for formulating the interstate highway system. On August 2nd, 1947, adequate funding for the interstate system didn't come. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1952 authorized $25 million for the system on a 50-50 matching basis. These were the first appropriated funds given to the system, even though it was a drop in the bucket. But 1953 was a turning point. Eisenhower, who had served as the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces during World War II, became the first Republican president elected in 2 decades. He brokered an armistice in Korea and enabled the United States to return to full peacetime production. There was also an explosion in automobile purchases. Between 1950 and 1960, the number of families owning cars increased from 60 to 77%. In the same decade, the number of railway passengers decreased from 37,000 to 25,000. In fact, railroad operations had only made a net profit during World War II since 1936, when the government curtailed automobile travel. One of the biggest shots in the arm for the interstate system was the Cold War. The Cold War played a pivotal role in the creation of the interstate highway system. After Eisenhower took office in 1953, Joseph Stalin died, setting off a power struggle in Russia. Nikita Khrushchev emerged as a general secretary of the Communist Party. The Soviets exploded their first hydrogen bomb on August 12, 1953, moving closer to the United States in nuclear parity and kicking off an aggressive nuclear arms race. This jolted an already riled U.S. public, which engaged in civil defense drills. Citizens built bomb shelters and stockpiled food, and there were rising fears of a nuclear war. Vice President Richard Nixon expressed concern over what he called the appalling inadequacies of existing U.S. road infrastructure in a July 1954 speech to the Governor's Conference. He critiqued it for its inability to meet the needs for responding to a national emergency on the scale of atomic war. He mentioned atomic war 10 times in his speech. 79% of the public thought a nuclear conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was imminent. If a nuclear war were imminent, it would require the evacuation of 70 million urban residents. Civil defense authorities were worried that a withdrawal from urban areas would be the largest ever attempted. One committee stated, "The rapid improvement of the complete 40,000-mile interstate system, including the necessary urban connections thereto, is therefore vital as a civil defense measure." A large-scale urban evacuation drill conducted in June 1955 drove home the importance of an evacuation plan.